Thank you for your patience. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm a high school teacher at heart, so if I'm too loud, just let me know. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Professor Rivera Malucci and Professor Edstrom and the Noise Scholars Program for having me come and speak with you this evening about the power of mathematics communities, teaching and learning in multiple spaces. I hope you're intrigued. I'm going to start with a picture. This was actually taken by a very good friend of mine who claims she is not a math person, but she was walking up Lenox Avenue one day and saw this gentleman. And I don't know if you can read this, but it says subtraction action. And he's doing some chalk art on the street with some math problems. And she said, "Oh, I know who would love this." And she sent this to me. And this picture really encapsulates much of what I'm going to be talking about this evening. How we do mathematics in multiple spaces. So not just in classrooms or instructional spaces here at Garner or Teachers College, but around the city, around our communities, and how this contributes to people seeing themselves as mathematics doers. So to start, I want to give you an overview of the talk. I'm going to preface the talk a bit with some of my own experiences so you can see why I'm so interested in these issues. And I'm going to turn to a discussion of who can do mathematics. This is sort of a bit of analysis about the discourse about who can be a mathematician, who does mathematics well. I'll talk about what academic communities are. I'll talk about what mathematical spaces are. And finally, we'll end by developing a blueprint for effective math communities and hopefully us taking this blueprint out into the world. So a little bit of a preface to the talk. I've been a lover of mathematics since I was a child, when my favorite neighbor, Kelly, would give me math problems from shiny new workbooks and tell me that I was great at math. When I went to school, I learned math mostly from teachers who taught the subject traditionally, but with great enthusiasm. Looking back, I can appreciate the genius of my 6th grade math teacher, who gave us pop quizzes that didn't look like any we had ever taken before. I still remember the multiplication maze that we had to figure out. My 9th grade geometry teacher told us that doing proofs was extremely difficult, but worth doing and doing well. And my 11th grade math teacher made sure my senior year schedule included advanced placement and calculus. "Why wouldn't you take AP calculus?" she asked me, when I told her I only need 3 years of math to graduate. In 12th grade, my math teacher expressed some consternation that my parents were allowing me to go to Canada as a student ambassador for the school district. He was concerned that I would miss several weeks of class. My Canadian host brother helped me learn the calculus I was missing while I was away. And one of my classmates explained what I had missed when I returned. I should say that this classmate is now a statistician, Brian Millen. Shout out to Brian wherever he is. He got his PhD in stats, but he helped me get through calculus when I got back. Because I did well in school mathematics, friends and classmates sought me out for math help, as did family members and neighbors. Thus it came as no surprise to many that I became a high school math teacher. While I received outstanding academic preparation as a public school elementary and secondary student, an undergraduate math major, a master's student in math education, and finally as a doctoral candidate, what I remember and value just as much are my math experiences with my family, with teachers and community members, and with other young people. These experiences, along with my formal preparation, have been equally important to any claim I have to being a quote-unquote math person, and have influenced how I think, teach about, and do mathematics and mathematics education research. Consequently, when I walk through city neighborhoods or through the halls of urban schools, I do not see them as empty of promise, although there are plenty of stories about what these areas, their schools, and their students lack. I look for the talent that I know is there. My own experiences of growing up in a big city and attending urban public schools revealed to me that there were young people, parents, teachers, school administrators, and neighbors who were interested in mathematics and who were also interested in and invested in my success. When I look at our cities, I expect to see the same communities committed to young people's school and mathematics success. This book and this talk is about my efforts to uncover these communities, which too often are hidden and ignored, and to encourage the teachers of young people, whether they're in or out of school, to not only look for, look at, and learn from communities that support mathematics success, but to help create and sustain them as well. So as you heard, much of my own experiences doing math from the time that I was a child before entering school, and while I was in school, interacting with my friends, my neighbors, my teachers who really were influential in getting me to become a math major in college, for example, have really shaped how I think about mathematics. And so my goal as a mathematics educator and as a mathematics education researcher is to sort of share this important narrative that math is something that everyone can do well. So I want to turn a little bit to the discourses that exist about who can do mathematics. And I want to start with a quote from Teresa Perry, who talks about all of our discussions of the achievement gap. You've heard of the achievement gap. The achievement gap discussion is one that talks about which groups of students, whether by ethnicity or gender or socioeconomic status, are performing better at mathematics than others. This is a common thing that we see in the newspapers and magazines, blogs. And what ends up happening is that there becomes a racialized hierarchy, as lots of mathematics education researchers have pointed out, including Rochelle Gutierrez and Danny Martin. And Teresa Perry, speaking about the achievement gap more generally in education, says that this conversation will almost surely reinforce this national ideology of Black intellectual inferiority. And as such, the conversation is likely to be the location of yet another narrative that further undermines how African American students are seen by others and how they see themselves. So this quotation really speaks to how what we see in popular culture, what we see in popular discourse, really reifies this notion that mathematics is really only for a select few. So this poster that was for a Super Saturday that was held last summer at the Harlem Armory is sort of a counter narrative or a counter picture to this prevailing discourse. But I will tell you that this discourse is very vivid, it's very present. When you think about movies and television shows, for example, I have a section of this book where I talk about math and popular culture and media and how all of the mathematicians are represented as, or the people who are doing mathematics are generally represented as being white or male. They usually have some kind of, they lack social skills, right? They're a little bit crazy. You think about all those movies like A Beautiful Mind, with John Nash having some mental illness. You think about Good Will Hunting with Matt Damon's character, whose name escapes me, having some psychological issues. When people do well in mathematics, they're seen as being a little crazy, right, in the popular culture. This is just kind of how the narrative is about mathematics in our culture. This ad that you're seeing here, I actually saw this ad in the Sports Illustrated magazine that I was looking at with my nephew, who is now 15, but at the time was probably, I don't know, 12 or 13 maybe. And we were reading some article about football or something, I don't remember what the sport was. And we turned to this and he said, oh, I guess this means I can't be an overachiever. There aren't any black kids in this graphic. So the tagline here for this Intel chip is overachievers meet your processor. So this is the representation of the students who are overachievers. So there are many other examples like this where you can see when kids are labeled as overachievers, kids are labeled as smart, kids are labeled as good at mathematics. Very rarely do you see Black and Latino kids represented in those images. So what we want to start doing is, instead of focusing on what Rochelle Gutierrez, for example, calls gap gazing, these endless discussions about the achievement gap that seek to sort of reify this narrative of high performance by some ethnic groups, low performance by others, we should really look at mathematics excellence where it occurs. There's a lot of variation across and within groups, and there are certainly excellent mathematics students who are Black and Latino who are in urban schools. So one very vivid example, I actually want to read a little bit to you about this discussion, does everyone know who this character is? Now, if you're not familiar with the television show A Different World, it was very popular. It's a Cosby Show spinoff. It was produced by Bill Cosby. It's all over YouTube, so you can just Google it and look at some episodes. It's a really interesting show. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's interesting from a mathematical standpoint. So in addition to these very vivid, very present narratives about the people who do well in mathematics being overwhelmingly white and male, there are at least two alternate media representations that present Black and Latino youth as capable of mathematics, and you probably know what they are. One is Stand and Deliver, if you remember that, a movie based on the true story of Jaime Escalante, who was a mathematics teacher at East Los Angeles' Garfield High, and A Different World, this television show I just referenced. A Different World was a television show that portrayed the lives of predominantly Black students attending a fictional historically Black college called Hillman. And these two representations, Stand and Deliver and A Different World, simultaneously both sort of confirm but also shatter some stereotypes that we have about students of color in math. So you probably already know a lot about Jaime Escalante and his work at Garfield High School. At one point, more than 25% of the Latino students taking the AP Calculus exam in the country were from that high school where Jaime Escalante was a teacher. So there's a vivid and rich body of work about that. You've seen the movie, which took some liberties, and we could talk a lot about that. But in the interest of time, I want to focus on Dwayne Wayne, because there's been a lot written about Stand and Deliver and the work of Jaime Escalante, published in research journals as well as the popular press, but much less on A Different World. And I would argue that A Different World is very important, and I will tell you why. A Different World was the first television show to regularly depict young Black people in college classrooms. While there are numerous essays and commentaries in the popular press that suggest that this television show was responsible for an increase in Black adolescents' interest in college, there's little empirical research on this issue that still needs to be done. But rather than focus on A Different World's many positive images of Black students and its portrayal of Blacks of multiple and complex backgrounds and experiences, I want to focus on one mind-bending, subversive character, Dwayne Wayne, who you see before you, who was a super nerd from Philadelphia, who not only became cool and got the girl, but also was shown doing math, loving math, earning his PhD in math, and embarking on what appeared to be a research career in mathematics. What is brilliant about the characterization of Dwayne Wayne is that the Different World writers allowed him to shift and mature from a nerdy, socially clueless, yet caring misfit, to an intellectual, attractive, and urbane adult who showed America what we had not seen on the small screen, a mathematically talented Black American. But Dwayne Wayne was unique in that his personality and humanity were not at odds with his mathematical abilities. He did not have to literally or figuratively become a different person in order to excel. So in part of my research, I have been working a lot with high school students and examining their mathematics communities, which I will talk about in a moment. But I've also been talking to mathematicians, African-American mathematicians, and Professor Rivera-Manucci mentioned a book that I'm finishing up that's about the experiences of Black mathematicians in the United States. These mathematicians that I interviewed and went to meetings with and went to talks by range in age from about 30 to about 90. So you can imagine the vast array and diversity of experiences that they've had. So I asked all these mathematicians a series of the same questions. And one question I asked them had to do with, how did you decide to become a math major in college, if indeed if you were a math major in college? So one young mathematician interviewed for my research project on mathematicians answered the question in this way. I said, how did you decide to become a math major in college? She said, did you watch A Different World? I was in love with Dwayne Wayne. Do you remember him? I thought I was so cool. Like, ooh, it's cool that he majored in math. I had this glorified image of going to an HBCU, that's a historically Black college or university, and majored in math. I thought I was going to be cool like Dwayne Wayne. And part of me was just like, well, I guess I'll be okay because I saw it. I saw it on TV, so it's not crazy. So this is an example of how one representation is recounted by a mathematician as sort of suggesting that it's not a crazy idea for me to be good in math and for me to want to do more in mathematics. So I want to shift a bit from these discourses around who can do mathematics to the academic communities that support students in their developing of mathematics talent. And as you can see, this graphic, which I have to thank my doctoral student, Nathan Alexander, for, it's beautiful, really encapsulates the different groups that students report. These are high-achieving high school students. When asked to describe what contributes to your high performance in mathematics, had all these very vivid stories about people who helped them. And you might expect that people would help them in the traditional way by tutoring them or showing them how to do math problems. But there were also really great examples of sort of non-traditional, or I guess I should say unexpected ways in which these communities supported students. For example, parents, guardians. When we think of parents or guardians contributing to students' mathematics performance, we might think, oh, you know, parents are helping students, parents are doing math with their students, those kinds of things. What many of these students would say are things like, well, they start out by saying, my dad didn't graduate from high school, but he was always really good at math. So he always exposed me to new mathematics ideas that I wasn't getting in school. That's something that is often unexpected in the research literature. So it's this notion that someone who may not have a high level of formal education still is contributing to mathematical knowledge building. This is a very important idea. And it was repeated fairly often in this group of high-achieving math students. These students came from urban areas. Also peers. So peers operated in a couple of different ways. So peers included friends and enemies. Friends included people you collaborated with, people you competed against. Who's the king of math? A couple of students would say, and there was constant competition around that. Cousins were also a very big sort of family influence. Cousins who went to another school, cousins who were older and in college, who would tell students, you should take this math class. Do you need help with this math concept? So again, some expected ways of support, but also some unexpected ways of support that are useful for us to think about. So this is an example of a sort of map of influences that I asked students to complete when I was interviewing them about who is contributing to your doing well in mathematics. And this is just an example. So the idea is that the student would have themselves in the center, and they would identify people, and eventually we discovered that we shouldn't say people, we should say, I was going to say places or things, but that's actually kind of right, people, places, or things. Because kids would say things like now, they were saying apps, things online, videos. But these students primarily were identifying people. So the teacher was an important influence, but sometimes the teacher was a former teacher, it wasn't the current teacher. It was a couple of kids would mention going back to their middle school teachers and talking to them about math. My mom, because she helps me with my math homework, so that's kind of something that we might expect. My aunt, because she's very good at math and she helps me with hard math homework, so some differentiation there. My friends, because when I still don't understand the work, they help me to figure it out. My cousins, because they're very good at math. So this is sort of a picture of what this student's academic community looks like. I want to share with you a little clip from one of the mathematicians I interviewed explaining a person that he describes as influential in his mathematics development. So we're going to hope for the best.
I'm Dwayne Cooper. I'm associate professor and chair of the Department of Mathematics at Morehouse College, and I'm pleased to be part of the project and share a couple stories with you. The one story is that I like to tell a lot. I tell it all the time when I teach analysis, sometimes other classes. I tell a story about how my grandfather, who lived, my mom grew up just a quarter mile from where we're sitting right now, and he had a way of always giving me mental challenges. And one story stands out in particular. We were on the front porch, and he said to me, Dwayne, if I walk halfway to the end of the porch, and halfway again, and halfway again, how many steps will it take for me to reach the end of the porch? And I'm a little boy, about 5, 6 years old, I think, at the time. And I guessed something from, I don't know, something 5. So he did it. He went halfway, in, halfway. And of course, he didn't reach the end of the porch because each step got smaller. And then I maybe guessed 10, you know. But then so he did it again. He did the little baby steps, continuing halfway to the porch. And of course, I called him up fairly quickly. Then, oh, you never get there, but you get so close. You get practically there. Now, he didn't talk about this in the line. He didn't say he was teaching basic premise of convergence. He didn't use that word. He didn't mention that he got within epsilon of the edge of the porch, whatever it is, depending on what epsilon is, of course. But but this basic idea was planted in me, and I just love that sort of thing. I love telling my students that not only is the sort of thing that they can do with their young students in the future, wherever they may be teaching, but also that they can do with their own grandchildren, that you can start to implant very high-level ideas into kids and stimulate their thinking, and you know, who knows what it stimulates in them and sort of understand the big ideas that they're connected to later.
So I really, when I first heard the story, it was audio taped, and I remember thinking, I've got to get this on video so teachers and kids can hear this. Because it's a great example of how this childhood experience with an adult, a family member, Dr. Cooper is still thinking about this example from when he was 5 or 6 to now when he's substantially more than 5 or 6. And he thinks about it when he's teaching his own students, when he's teaching his own calculus courses. And he's recounting the story to them in the hopes that they will do similar things with their students. So there's kind of this generational effect that's being passed on from his grandfather through Dr. Cooper to his own students that I think is really, really nice to see. So that's an example of how a member of one's family can be part of the strong, academic community that supports mathematics learning and engagement. So it became clear to me as I was talking to high school students, as I was talking to mathematicians, that it wasn't just about the communities that really were shaping their mathematical experiences. It was also about where these experiences were taking place. So I started thinking about mathematical spaces. And this owes a great theoretical debt to the work of several theorists who think about cultural geography. Space, in the sense of cultural geography, is more than just a location. It's more than just the LOE room. It's this notion of the social and cultural ideas of place, the meaning that humans attribute to place, and the cultural and social knowledge surrounding various locations. So in this previous story we just heard, the porch that's down the street from the college where Dr. Cooper is now a professor. That's a very specific environment in Atlanta, near the Atlanta University Center. That was a very rich educational environment, right? And so I am terming mathematical spaces as sites where mathematics knowledge is developed, sites where induction into a particular community of mathematics viewers occurs, sites where relationships or interactions contribute to the development of a strong mathematics identity. So it's not to say necessarily that all this is happening in every mathematical space, but these things can happen and at least one of these activities is happening. So one thing I want us to hold in our heads is to think about how we can get more of these mathematical spaces to happen for young people. I argue that for some young people, particularly those who are high achievers, they're already sort of inhabiting these spaces. Sometimes they already have these communities of support, but we can get more communities of support for young people and have more vibrant, developed mathematical spaces. So I have been, as I mentioned, talking to high school students and mathematicians about their narratives of doing mathematics. And so these mathematical spaces are both in school, as you might expect in mathematics classrooms, for example. They also happen outside of school, like Dr. Cooper's porch story, that was in an outside school context. And they also kind of happen in these in-between spaces. So these are a few quotes. The italicized quotes are from mathematicians, and the ones that aren't italicized are from high school students. So as you might imagine, there's some very rich and wonderful stories behind these little short quotes. I'm only going to tell you a couple of stories based on this. So the school and teachers, this is a common, unfortunately not common enough, experience that high school students both report and mathematicians report as well. So Lever is a mathematician who has been telling the story about a teacher who, when she discovered that he was really good at mathematics, would give him her college algebra books to study from. And then she would also give him half the class to teach. He went to a very small rural school in one of the Carolinas. And so it was a one-room schoolhouse back in the 50s. And so she would give him half the room to teach, and she would teach the other half. And he still remembers the story about how she gave him these college algebra books, and he says, didn't ask for them at the end of the year. It was such a privilege to have her book. I really like that story. High school students talk about math teachers doing things outside of the realm of normal class instructions. Oh, you know, our math teacher's always giving us puzzles, like to exercise my mind or something, or he's telling us interesting things about mathematics. Those are the kinds of things that current high school students do. The neighborhood, so we heard about the grandfather and the Atlanta University neighborhood, but also I have a really great story, which I don't have time to tell you, about a mathematician who's talking about an older kid in his neighborhood peer group who also gave his peers like math puzzles and played chess with them, and even when they played touch football on the street, there was rigor involved, this mathematician, I remember very vividly telling me. You know, everything, we had to have it correctly done. There were rules, there was rigor, it was like a mathematical system. You know, very vivid narratives about this. This story about the porch you heard, this is a high school student, Linus, who has a very rich description of how his family supports him, the cousins pushing him. Linus also has a sister who says things like, you got an 85 on this test. Why get an 85? You only know 85% of this stuff? What's up with that? So Linus talks very vividly about not only his cousins, but his sisters and other family members. And finally, the after-school classroom, which is sort of what we could consider to be a kind of in-between mathematical space. That's how we got our trig. This is actually a story, another very short video that I want to share with you, where this is a mathematician talking about an experience from high school. This is another professor from Spelman College. Recording. This is Dr. Sylvia Bozeman at Spelman College. And Dr. Bozeman, you told me once a really interesting story about mathematics when you were growing up, and about a teacher, specifically Mr. Holly. I wonder if you could tell me about that.
Well, Mr. Holly was my math teacher, I think, through most of high school. And the thing that I remember most about him was how energetic he was. He was just out of college and had been a math major in college and teaching in a small high school in a small town, his hometown. And he was, this was about the time of Sputnik. So we're talking a few years back, but a time when the country was really focusing on math and science. So he had the opportunity to attend some of the NSF institutes that were around the country at that time to try to, I think those institutes were to really inspire people to focus on math and science. And I think as a result of those institutes, he was really, excited about teaching math. So the thing I remember most about him was the incident that I remember most is when we got to trigonometry. And it was time for us to take trigonometry, and the county would not allow him to offer the course because the Board of Education said that we didn't have enough students to take trigonometry. And we were all so disappointed, and so was Mr. Holly, but he felt that we really did need trigonometry to be prepared for college. So he made a deal with the parents, and he told our parents that if you will bring these students back in the evenings after school, then I will teach them trigonometry at night. And it worked. They told, they agreed, and they brought us back. We lived out on the farms and the countryside, and they drove us back in, and he taught trigonometry at night.
So there are a couple things about Dr. Bozeman's story that I want to highlight. First, you heard a little bit about policy in there, right? Where the school district said it's too few students to offer a trigonometry class. So this is some policy decision, and this is a teacher who says, I'm going to do something about that. And so in collusion with the parents and students, offer this trigonometry experience. I am really sad to report that this kind of thing still happens today. So you will have instances in high schools in New York City, some of whom I work with, where there are deemed too few students to offer a particular class. Ironically, in one of the schools, it was trig. And so you had a situation in 2012 in New York City where a high school was not offering trig because, quote, too few students were ready to take it. So this kind of thing is troubling, particularly given the real importance of mathematics to students' high school outcomes, future life chances. There's all kinds of research about this kind of, the importance of mathematics to those types of outcomes. The other thing I wanted to point out about Dr. Bozeman's story that she didn't talk too much about in this was, but as she talks about this later in her interview with me, she talks about sort of the peer community that developed as part of Mr. Hawley's class, his after-school trig class, and also his regular classes. And so I think the power of students' peer groups is really important and something for us to tap into. That has really been the bulk of my research with high school students, examining students' peer groups and identifying ways that we can use those peer groups effectively to support mathematics learning. So I'm going to shift a little bit to discuss, get another example of sort of a mathematics community developing in a mathematical space. I have been working with Lowell High School, that's a pseudonym, roughly since about 2003, in a variety of ways. So one of the principals some years ago identified some challenges, and these were some of the challenges that he identified. And the opportunities that we identified together were that there was a critical mass of high-achieving students, and that the peer groups seemed to be, even when you just sort of observed in classes, regardless of the type of class, were largely supportive, non-judgmental, and expansive. And this was also verified by a survey I did with students about their peer groups and what kids had to say about what would happen if they did well in school, how would their peer groups respond to that, or someone in the school got an A in the math class, what would happen? And we could see that kids were really largely supportive of each other. And that may have had something to do with the fact that the school is a small school, but I think it was a very, I think peer groups in general, if you look at the peer group literature, particularly for Black and Latino students, there is some research, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, by John Agu and other people, which suggests that peer groups can be very negative about, particularly in the African American community, about high achieving, about students who are high achieving, that those students get teased or, they're suggested to be acting white, things like this. The literature and the research on this is actually much more varied than that. There are lots of different responses to high achievement. There's a lot of support for it. There's teasing certainly, but there's a bigger picture than just the common and popular discourse that we hear about peer groups. So we were operating at Lowell from the standpoint that peer groups were going to be supportive of students' math engagement. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is the development of this peer tutoring program that arose from some work I had done myself as a teacher, where I developed where I developed a peer tutoring program for students who were struggling with geometry, because I couldn't tutor all 40 students myself. It became clear to me that we were going to have to do some peer tutoring. And so we identified high-achieving high school students in math at the school, some of whom were identified by the principals, some of whom were identified by teachers, and other students identified peer tutors, and that was a very effective way. what we did was we asked the teachers the standard question, who does well in mathematics? And the teachers would say, oh, this person has an A, and that person has an A, so they were identifying those students. When we asked students who does well in mathematics here, the students were identifying other people who were sort of unnoticed by teachers. And the kids would say things like, this person's really good at explaining things when I don't get it. So they were already identifying tutors in a way, not just kids who were doing super well in mathematics. So they would identify, for example, solid B students who really had a talent for explaining. So I'm going to skip to session organization. There were after-school sessions 3 days a week, and it was an organic program in that we allowed the students to run it. I was there, and the high school teachers at Lowell were there just as supervisors, because in New York City you have to have a teacher in the room for any after-school activity, just so you know. But the students were really responsible, and that was deliberate, because what we had seen in math classes at Lowell was that kids were very used to the teacher giving them all the information, all the direction about mathematics. And you would see kids sort of paralyzed if they were stuck, and they would just wait patiently for the teacher to come around and help them. And they would raise their hand. There was no discussion among students. There was no idea that maybe you could use some other methods to try to figure it out on your own. So we were really trying to get at that, develop students' sense of agency that they could do mathematics themselves. So the program operated in a couple of different incarnations, which were very different. So this is the same school, pretty much the same population. Year one was very different from year two. And it speaks to the notion that you can have this kind of experience and this kind of program in pretty much any setting with any kids. So the first year there were mainly female tutors, mainly 9th to 10th graders, 10 to 20 students per week. Originally it was twice a week. The kids wanted to go to 3 times a week, so we had to negotiate a bit with the principal and the teachers to do that. After the first year, there was a shift in the school leadership, and I wasn't able to get in and train a new set of tutors. And I ran into the assistant principal on the street, and she said, the kids are still trying to do your peer tutoring program. They're meeting in the cafeteria. So that made me very happy that it was living on, even in a kind of informal way. Year two was mainly male tutors, and it was a lot more than, as you can see, 15 to 20. So the first training session I had, 20 young men showed up, pretty much. There were a few girls, but mainly young men. There was a very charismatic teacher who the students really responded to, who championed the program from the beginning, and I think that definitely had something to do with the enthusiasm for it. In both instances, there were non-hierarchical interactions developed. And by that I mean, instead of it being sort of the teacher here and the student here, the students would be helping each other, and eventually the teachers would be walking around listening to how the students were explaining mathematics concepts. And the students began to feel very comfortable at challenging the teachers. I have a few examples in here where there's one tutor who says, don't tell her, to the teacher, don't tell her how to do it, she has to know it for herself. You're not going to be there doing the test for her. This is what a kid said, respectfully, but to the teacher, which was definitely a non-hierarchical relationship. This program really took off right away. There were 20 to 40 students per week. The school had about 300 students total, so that tells you the sense of how many kids were participating. And the kids had some really great ideas, and this is an example of how sometimes our administrative structures can impede student engagement and interest in mathematics. So let me just finish this slide and take your question. So as an example, the peer tutoring program happened after school largely. So it started out twice a week. The kids wanted to go immediately to 3 days a week. They wanted it 4 days a week, and there wasn't a teacher who could or who would stay. So the kids were like, oh, well, okay, can we do 3 days a week and have it during lunch? Right? And one of the kids said, we can have like a genius bar, kind of like at the Mac store, and you could come up to people in the cafeteria. And there was all this discussion at the administrative level about who was going to supervise that, how would it work, these kinds of things. So this is an instance where student interest, excitement, enthusiasm. There are things that we do, and I include myself in this, as administrators, educators, that unfortunately have the end result of thwarting student progress. So this is something that we want to be aware of, those of us who are educators. So here are some selected findings about the students' mathematics practice within the session. So while you're sort of reading that, I'll take this question that you have.
Oh, and actually related to the second slide before it, so.
Okay.
If you want to read this slide.
Okay.
But when you were saying the number of tutors, it was like 4 to 6 tutors, they're mostly female, and then, I don't remember the other number.
15 to 20.
15 to 20, those were secondary school.
Yes, these were high school students.
And then also in the classroom were there 9 graduate students, 9 teaching college students?
Yes. So in the first year, this is sort of a pedagogical as well as a research problem. The first year, you want it to be successful. So as an educator, I don't want the peer tutoring program to fail. I don't know the students. The teachers at the school are really concerned, well, what will happen if a kid doesn't understand? Or if a tutor can't help another student? What will happen then? We'll have to jump in. And that was not what I wanted, because that would just sort of, underscore that the teacher is the source of all mathematical knowledge. So I was like, let's have an intervening level. Let's have some graduate students from TC who are pre-service teachers to sort of be there as kind of mentors or advisors. So if we have this situation where a young person gets stuck explaining something, then they can ask the TC tutor. And that worked pretty well, because as time went on, what ended up happening was, I have to tell you, the TC mentors weren't really doing much. Because after a while, you can read more about this, the kids really just sort of took off and ran with it. And we started to see these sort of, when I was talking about the non-hierarchical groups before, we started to see these groups of classroom teachers, TC graduate students, and high school students all talking about a mathematics problem, which was really nice to see. So that happened in the first year, not so much in the second year.
Okay.
There weren't really TC graduate students involved that year. So just to summarize, I think effective mathematical spaces have some characteristics, and they may not always have all of these characteristics, but in thinking about my research with mathematicians who are talking about the communities that they have formed and they belong to, when I look at my work over the years with high school students, this in general is what seems to be happening with these mathematical spaces. There's some kind of historical piece involved in that. When I think about the peer tutoring program, for example, at Lowell, that there's kind of a history of us doing that program there, and the kids know that, and the kids talked about it. So when I walked in another year and said, can you recruit some volunteers for tutors? The kids said, oh yeah, we did that a few years ago. I remember that, I really liked that. So it was kids who had been freshmen who were now, seniors who, oh, I can tutor now. That was the big thing. So there's some kind of history involved. It's very helpful to have a charismatic and a fully engaged leader. That also is somewhat problematic, because as you can imagine, if that leader goes, sometimes the program isn't sustained. But if you have a critical mass of faculty or individuals committed to the endeavor, even if that charismatic person departs, sometimes you can keep it going. A really great example of this is something that I'm working on now, which is sort of an analysis of the STEM departments at Spelman College, particularly the mathematics department. So you saw Dr. Bozeman, who's been a former chairperson of the mathematics department at Spelman. But Dr. Bozeman, when she tells you the story about Spelman, tells you about these other individuals who came before her, including people who mentored her. And one person who mentored her was Dr. Etta Faulkner, who is, I think it's safe to say, responsible for a lot of Spelman women pursuing their interests in mathematics and getting their PhD. Now, Dr. Faulkner unfortunately died, I think, in the 90s. But her legacy is so strong at Spelman. When you walk into the mathematics department, there's obvious visuals with Dr. Faulkner. I mean, there's the science building is actually named. She's one of the people that the science building is named after. But any faculty member and pretty much any Spelman student can tell you about Dr. Faulkner. I have friends who were not math majors who went to Spelman, who were English majors, for example, who can tell you about Dr. Faulkner. So this is someone who really had a significant impact, and was also very good at developing others. So she mentored Dr. Bozeman, who is in turn mentoring lots of other people, who's created programs to keep women in STEM and help women pursue PhDs in mathematics, for example. So this is really, this leader aspect, this historical aspect, and developing a critical mass of individuals who are committed to it is a very important idea. The presence of role models, this is why I think the peer tutoring program is so, can be very effective, because essentially instead of the role model for mathematics as being the teacher, you have a role model being a fellow teenager, and in a very positive way. These effective mathematical spaces have a focus on rigorous mathematics content. It's not remediation. It's often about helping students do better, but also exposing them to other concepts, which happened in the peer tutoring program a number of times. And this is getting to my point that I was mentioning about Dr. Faulkner, for example. The program or institution reproduces itself. I think this is very important. This is why Spelman's mathematics department has such a lengthy, identifiable, rich legacy, and other programs sort of have ebbs and flows, right? So when I talk to Dr. Bozeman, she can talk about other students that she's mentored, other mathematicians that she's mentored, people who are not only at Spelman, but who are at other institutions. So it's kind of like seeding other places to develop these really effective mathematical spaces. So this is these are ideas that I'm still working out and still analyzing in my work, examining mathematics departments, whether they're and mathematics initiatives, whether they're at colleges or high schools. So lastly, I promised you a blueprint for how we can create these effective mathematical spaces and these rich and positive mathematics communities. And I think to begin, we have to reimagine mathematical people. So I've talked at length about that. We have to recognize that there's mathematics excellence everywhere, in every school, in every classroom. It's on us as teachers and educators to find it and to nurture it and to support it and to facilitate that spreading. I think these programmatic obstacles to student success in school, there are too many instances where I hear from teachers or students themselves where there are sort of little things that could be changed that could really have a big effect in facilitating math success, so we need to do that. The other thing we must do is to develop mathematical spaces that are intentional and permanent instead of unintentional and fleeting. By this I mean, it's great that we have these sort of informal networks, communities that exist, but I think to address some of the real issues that we have in urban education, in mathematics in particular, we need some permanence. We need to be intentional about developing and crafting these spaces. So I think to end, I'm just going to leave this is actually a picture of the peer tutoring program at work. I like this picture because it connotes a lot of movement, a lot of people sort of earnestly working together. I cropped the picture somewhat weirdly because I was in it, and I hate being in a picture, but you can see that there are teachers and students just all interacting around math. And this is what one of the students had to say about it. Figuring out for myself how to better explain it to other people helps me understand it better too. I just think this is like super helpful. It's very, very helpful. And I guess I feel the more they can do it, the more they should do it. So this is an example of a young person wanting more opportunities to engage in mathematics in a positive way. So there's one more slide that will have my suggestions for how we can build effective math communities from a school and community-wide standpoint. And I think these networks and communities, both formal and informal, are really important. And we should also think about the diversity and richness of math experiences that we're providing, from what we do with our young people at home before they enter school, thinking about Dr. Cooper's grandfather, exposing him to some mathematics, right, on his porch, puzzles, games that we play, I think that as a prolific reader myself, I think reading is very important, and we do a lot of reading with kids. We should also do math-related things with kids as well. I think that would do a lot to reshape how young people think about mathematics. It's something that's fun, something that's engaging, and something that you do with your friends. It's not just about the school mathematics that you do, but also sort of a mathematical way of being. Thank you very much. I'm happy to entertain any questions, any comments.
We're practicing our wait time.
That's right. Okay, I like that. Yeah.
You mentioned that sometimes talking about the achievement gap can reinforce the stereotype that minority students, blacks and Latinos, don't do well at math. So do you think that should be addressed at all?
That's a really great question. What I will say is that I think the achievement gap is really an opportunity gap. So when you look at all the measures of opportunity that there are, including, course taking, advanced courses that are available in schools. We just talked about trig not being available in some high school in New York in 2012. When you look at socioeconomic factors that affect the school, the quality of teachers in the schools, all of those things contribute to the disparities in achievement we see. So I think the issue is not so much that the achievement, the way that we talk about it centers on what's wrong with the student, instead of what are the systems in place that are preventing achievement. The other thing I would say about that is that all of our discussion about the achievement gap really focuses on failure and who's failing with regards to whom. And even how we talk about the achievement gap isn't really accurate. When you hear discussion about the achievement gap often on the news or read about it in the papers, it's posited as white students and everyone else. Well, that's inaccurate because Asian students on average are outperforming white students, but somehow it doesn't get cast in that way. So it's a very nuanced, complex discussion that needs to allow for a range of excellence within ethnic groups. There are students who are high achieving across all of those ethnic groups, and there are students who are low achieving across all those ethnic groups. So my goal when I look at the national outcomes for the United States, it's clear to me that everyone needs to do better. So by increasing access and opportunity for everyone, we can improve our performance overall. Yes.
I noticed that most of your detailed research was in secondary school.
Yes.
Without getting into one of these reductionist sequences where it all comes back to prenatal nutrition, it seems to me that the damage is done in the elementary schools. And part of it has to do with the content week preparation of elementary teachers. They have no clue as to what underlies arithmetic. Another aspect has to do with the fact that people revert to their habit that was ingrained in them as learners. I teach as I was taught. But the focus of all of this is that elementary arithmetic and mathematics below the junior high school level is primarily taught as a system for getting answers, which are predetermined. In other countries and in some schools in this country, children are invited to consider a multiplicity of ways to get the same answer or to get different answers and to justify them. That is the beginning of real mathematics. And without that, the process for the next 6 years of overcoming it and reawakening an interest in the field and also allowing that there's more to mathematics than arithmetic becomes doubly difficult. My own background, just to fill you in, I have a doctorate in mathematics. I've taught math, math ed, SAT, related material. I'm retired. I went from my retirement party to a position as a volunteer tutor in math for a social agency, and I get young people who are by any definition both possess of great potential and seriously damaged. And some can be salvaged. A new interest can be revived or reawakened by moving them off the expectation that there's an answer and they have to get it. And of course, some are determined to get through standardized tests and move on to the next level. But I do not believe that all of the effort can be focused on the secondary school. In particular, there was one thing that caught my attention right away. It had to do with your reference to, at first, the high school age tutors to use traditional classroom procedures. That means that it's I show you, you do what. And that is exactly what schools should try to get away from. And I think, I also administered an NSF secondary program at one point in service. I think schools really need to be attacked on multiple fronts without in any way saying what you're doing, which seems to me to be very thoughtful and filled with ideas.
Let me
It's not going to do it.
let me just address a few of your points, because I agree with pretty much all of them. So I want to start by saying that this piece of my work exists in a larger body of work that looks at the continuum of mathematics education. So I've worked with elementary teachers who have the issues that you talked about, and developed professional development seminars for them, and experiences for them that seek to get at this notion that math is this very rigid, all procedure-based field. So there's a lot of work to be done there. What I was seeing with the high school students, and I'm sorry that this slide didn't make it clear, is that despite their experiences with their own teachers in high school and probably elementary school, where math was a very much you do this, you do that, over the course of the program, they developed some very interesting, thoughtful strategies to address students' conceptual understanding. So it was like we were watching them develop as really strong teachers before our eyes, and their own high school teachers were learning from those students. Just to give you an example, there were situations when I would visit Lowell High School classrooms after the program had been going on for several months, and the teacher would say, when the teacher went through an explanation of a concept and some kids still didn't get it, the teacher would say, well, you know what, after school last week, Teresa explained it this way. Teresa, do you want to try to explain it? You used a really interesting analogy. And Teresa in the classroom right then would explain it. So we would see a really rich, developed pedagogical skill set among tutors without us really, we talked about problem solving and seeing math as not these isolated sets of facts, but it's all connected. We talked about that and gave students experiences with that, but there was a development process that was very interesting and should be looked at further. Lastly, I was a high school teacher myself, and I originally started looking at what was happening in high school, in large part as a reaction to people saying things to me like, oh, by high school it's too late. I can't accept that as a teacher, professor, educator, human being. If we think high school is too late to do anything with young people, then we're really in a world of trouble. So I have focused a lot of my work on re-engaging students who are either already engaged or really want to be engaged in school and engaged by mathematics. And I think what some of my work has shown with high school students is that it doesn't take rocket science necessarily. It's one way to do it is to create these communities, to allow students to talk about mathematics, to do mathematics together, to see different people doing mathematics can really have an impact. My work with mathematicians started out as being a historical study to really look at differences in the schooling experiences that they had and how that affected their mathematics development. But what I soon discovered, which is why I've incorporated some of this in this book and in this talk, is that they had such rich discussions about their own adolescent experiences, both inside and outside of school, that I thought we could really learn from as a community of educators, that high school students could probably learn from, that elementary students could learn from. So this is something that I'm continuing to work on. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Hi, hello everyone. I just wanted to say a comment that thank you for doing this research. I'm learning a lot. I haven't been in school in years. But what I noticed is that when you said the high school students, that was the population you're working with, and I said sometimes they're not offered this 2012, certain classes. I definitely understand that because my sister is 18 and I graduated high school in 89, a little bit older. But when I went to high school, I went in Manhattan and we had AP classes and all of that stuff. So I was fine. So I was in shock when she went to high school. She went in Brooklyn. The first one she was for 3 years. There were no AP classes. And the last one she transferred to the Terra School. And for 1 year, and also no AP classes. And so especially with math, she's a really good, smart student, but I do feel she was held a little bit back because they just don't offer that push. I guess I don't know the politics with Board of Education or Department of Education, but it's terrible because they need that support from, of course, the peers students. Because I asked her about her friends, are they really smart? What are their views? They want to go to college, and they just want to get out of high school, and that's it. And then the school, that's what they do, get them out because they have another incoming class. So thank you for showing us that it is that in 2012 there's still a problem, and the students, especially in the urban community, they don't have the same opportunities as other ones. Because her school is 99%, just brown faces, and it's terrible. I mean, the kids are really talented. I went to the talent shows, so they have different talents, but it's just that strong academic environment, especially with math and other sciences, it's just not there.
Right.
And this is what she graduated 2012, June of 2012. So it's a very different experience from what I went through, where I had all that support, but I went to a different school. It's public school, but I had a very different experience, and that was years ago.
These kinds of policy issues are really important, and we really have to mobilize around them and stay on top of them. Even Jaime Escalante's school, Garfield High, when he left that school, the AP Calculus program sort of died. And this was a nationally recognized, nationally known, successful program. And so this is an example of sort of that one individual who's really, making it go, and then when that person leaves, what happens? And so I would imagine that in city schools, we could see this sort of ebb. I've seen it at Lowell, this kind of ebb and flow where sometimes opportunities are offered and they're taken away, and they should be constant. These things should be normalized. This should be the reality that you should have the opportunity to take AP Calculus, to take these advanced math classes. It should not be optional that they're present in your school. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, in terms of the policy context, I feel like, so you have your story and she's got her story, 2012, this is happening. I suggest it's far more widespread simply because, the current policy context is let's take these big comprehensive high schools and let's split them into these smaller learning communities. And these smaller schools do not have the capacity to offer a class if only 4 students are eligible or 5 students might be eligible to take the AP. They're not going to get. So this gets replayed over and over and over and over again across many small schools.
Mm-hmm.
I'm imagining that, like I said, it's a lot more widespread.
I think you're absolutely right. And there are some schools I know that sort of network themselves and sort of combine groups of students to offer these classes,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not happening everywhere. It's sort of really haphazard and
how
ad
many Mr.
hoc.
Hileys are there that are going to do it, come back in the evening and help teach
Right. So this is a real problem. Let me get this person and then.
I went to high school in Massachusetts, and I know my high school, they started leveling math when you were in 7th grade. So you were either in honors or the middle level or lower. And there was a lot of discussion about that because it was pretty hard to switch levels as you got older. So I don't know, do you think that is a bad policy to level it because the people in the higher level are getting challenged and exposed to more difficult concepts, whereas people who get stuck, for instance, in the middle or lower level may never be challenged as much?
I think in mathematics there are lots of types of tracking that happen. So there's leveling in the sense that you mean that is sort of honors or regular, whatever, advanced, that kind of thing. But there's also sort of a tracking that exists in mathematics is, I think, unique and different from other subjects in that, you know, whether and when you take algebra really affects what you can do in high school, what you can do in college, what kinds of opportunities you'll have. And there's really not the same kind of system that happens in other disciplines. So I think there's a body of research on parochial schools where those schools are tracked, but it's assumed that everyone is doing college prep work. So I'm not a person who's anti-tracking just for the sake of being anti-tracking, but where I do see a problem is that when we identify who's in the lower tracks, it often doesn't have anything to do with their performance or knowledge base, but other factors are at play. Sometimes that's socioeconomic status, sometimes that's race and ethnicity. It's whether your parents advocated for you. You know, I have my own experiences where I was always a very talented, very strong math student, and suddenly in 8th grade I wasn't placed in 8th grade algebra. And my parents said, what happened? And the administrator said, well, she didn't take the test in 7th grade to determine, you know, so that she could be placed in algebra. So I'm a 7th grade student, you know, I'm not really paying attention, you know, I didn't take a notice home, something like that, right? That's what happened. So my parents pushed and said, give her the test now, but they had to really push for that and advocate for it. So I got an 8th grade algebra, which should have been kind of a no-brainer. Like, why is there a test? So there are lots of different ways that we can think about leveling, but where I think it's really problematic is when it holds students back. And it's applied very capriciously. So you're from Boston, there's a couple of really great studies by Elizabeth Usain from the 90s, so they're kind of dated, but they're fascinating because she talks about this very issue, leveling in mathematics. So one paper is middle schools and ability groups, so what you're talking about starting in 7th grade, and who gets placed in what group, and how she basically has determined that is sort of parental influence and knowledge networks of parents, not at all really related to performance. And then she has another paper which is probably even more interesting and disturbing that is, I can't think of what that one's called, but it's essentially about the absence or presence of calculus in 2 districts in Massachusetts. So she collected some quantitative data but also interviewed administrators. And the administrators' interviews are fascinating because different districts, different schools have different policies about whether to offer calculus to high school students or not. And some of the things that these people were saying, you know, were vastly in opposition to each other. And these are district administrators. So there's not even agreement among that group. So I think, in general, tracking seems to me to be a very capricious system, not applied equitably. And unless it's assuming that everyone should have some rigorous math experience, everyone should have the opportunity to have the option of going to college, then I think it's problematic. But look at Usain's work. It's really, I think you will find it interesting being from Massachusetts. Yes?
I think we sort of talked about this a little bit before, but I was wondering if you could just comment more on this. I'm from a really small town in rural New Hampshire, and we were lucky enough to have a really broad course offering the first 7 classes. So we had calculus, AB, and Calc BC. But I know my cousin's school half an hour away. They didn't have calculus BC. So my senior year, a girl came and like traveled half an hour just to take our class. So I was surprised to hear that like it's sort of even less common in urban schools because you would think that like because it's closer, it's all in one urban space. That's maybe more possible for students who are like don't have a class offered or don't have AP classes at all offered at their schools to just travel to the next public school over and maybe a 5-minute ticket right off the bus. And how often does that happen or why does that not happen?
I don't know how often it happens. I know of it happening on occasion, and I know of it not happening, as in the case of Lowell School, as you'll read. So I think there needs to be some systematic analysis of this question. I kind of think in mathematics education and education in general, we sometimes think things are settled questions. Like we sometimes think that, oh, every school has, AP calculus exists, so every school has AP calculus, and that's just not the case. Every school doesn't even have pre-calculus or trig, for example. So I think some systematic analysis in the form of a doctoral dissertation, perhaps, or some research. I'll be very interested in how, as Dr. Rivera-Manucci was saying, small schools. I think we've heard about this somewhat anecdotally about the challenges of offering a full curriculum within these schools, but I think some more systematic work needs to be done. And it may have been done, I just don't know of it currently. But I think it's a very interesting set of questions. I can't remember who, did you already ask a question? No? Okay.
I was just wondering, I'm not really sure how to phrase this, but I do remember you mentioning something about not wanting to take another math because you had already 3 years.
Oh yes, that's such a good story.
Well, I was wondering about some standardized tests, and I know like the New York State regions, you have a specific requirement of test you have to take, and then you could be done technically. Do you think that the existence of some of these standardized testing is kind of stopping people from continuing their math education because they think I'm done with my requirement and I don't need to continue?
Oh, what a great question. I would suspect that the answer is probably yes for some people. Unless, if there's a requirement that there's 4 years of mathematics even after you pass the test, which I think there is for most schools, so you probably have to keep going. In Georgia at the time, as you heard from my preface, there was only 3 years, so I just thought, oh, I'm done, great. But this is just, general teenage stupidity. I mean, why would I be done? But it took, and I'm sure my parents would not let me do that, but a teacher had to say, okay, are you kidding? Like, why would you do that? But it's just, I think that story and some other stories that I could tell you, not just about me, but about high school students in general, are and these mathematicians, are examples where there's some critical points, transition points often between middle school and high school, when people decide to become math majors or not, when people decide to go for calculus or not, where there's some intervention occurring. And sometimes it's just someone saying, your homeroom teacher saying, why wouldn't you take AP calculus? And that was enough for me to say, oh yeah, okay. But I think that happens not infrequently, that there's these little mini interventions that happen that keep people on track. And if you don't get those interventions, I think it's very easy to just sort of default to, oh, I've done it, I've done enough, I can stop. I don't really know enough about math to know if I want to do it as a major or not, and just not having the information. I think that is not an infrequent occurrence. Yes?
So I am a physics major, and I feel like I didn't really understand math beyond arithmetic until I really was in science classes, and through my science and physics classes, I started to kind of see more like a mathematical understanding of it, similar to how you learn like English grammar better when you're in a foreign language class. Maybe that's when you learn your English grammar because you see it in different contexts. And I was just wondering if any of your research or if you had any experience with either looking at how you integrate more science examples into math classes, or if you went into any sort of science classes and saw how they were presenting some math topics. And then just also something we commonly, I think, link math and science together, but there's also a very strong link to math and music. So I was wondering if you ever had any experience with looking at music classes or integrating the arts into math education.
I have not personally examined the integration of science and math. I'm trying to think if that's true in various. More in the elementary school, I kind of see teachers, because elementary school teachers are generalists, and so they often seek out ways to integrate topics. I've seen it at that level, and I know that people do it and do it very well. Actually, in some of these small schools, because the science teacher is often the math teacher. So I've sort of seen it there, but haven't studied it systematically. In terms of the links between mathematics and music, I think that you're right on about that. It's something that I haven't yet explored. I'm very interested in exploring it because this mathematician data set is kind of the gift that keeps on giving in terms of my research. So it originally started out as just a little paper I was going to write about, high school math experiences of mathematicians, and it expanded into this book. And I still probably, I'm constantly thinking of other things I can write about it. But one thing that came out is that a number of these mathematicians are musicians, and really strong musicians. And I have a great quotation from one mathematician who was trying to decide if he was going to go to graduate school in mathematics, or if he was going to major in mathematics, or if he was going to go to a music conservatory to become a musician, a professional musician. And he met with this math professor at his now alma mater, who said, "Don't join the band." That was enough for him to stay at that institution and be a math major. So oftentimes mathematicians talk about it in terms of this kind of hard choice they have to make, because they feel that they can't practice mathematics and music at a high level and devote themselves to both of them. So they kind of have to make a choice, but they sort of keep their hand in a way. So I have one mathematician who says, I write a little bit. It's not Ellington, but it's Curry, which is his last name is me. And so I do see a lot of that.
Mathematics in the arts has a long history. Group theory was given a lot of impetus by problems of design, and elementary teachers and training should be taught how to integrate mathematics with the arts, and weaving and embroidery and book listing and mosaic, all kinds of issues, and children love it. They just love it. And there's no reason at all that there should be this C.P. Snow style separation, except that it exists. And I think we tend to emphasize it to the detriment of both disciplines.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to thank Dr. Walker. We're going to give her a couple of minutes to breathe. Her book is for sale outside in the hallway if anyone's interested, and Dr. Walker will be available to sign books in a few minutes. Thank you for coming. And just one quick announcement. So this is the first in a series that will be ongoing this semester. We're planning to have 3 more talks, and there's a flyer outside if you didn't get it. I think it's got the green.
Yeah, it's got the green
Got
on
the
it.
green stripe on the side. So look for upcoming talks as well. Thank you for coming.